The space race started with the Cold War period between the United States and Russia. The Cold War was a state of political and military tension after World War II between powers in the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War started in 1947. After the Cold War started in the late 1940s, space just became another part of it, beginning in the late 1950s. Each side sought to prove the superiority of its technology, its military firepower, and its political, economic system. On October 4th, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into space. In the United States, space was seen as the next frontier, and it was crucial not to lose much ground to the Soviets. The U.S. made gathering intelligence about the Soviets an urgent matter. In 1958, the U.S. launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by the U.S. Army under the direction of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. In 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. In 1959, the Soviet space program took another step forward with the launch of Luna 2, which was the first space probe to hit the moon. April 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth in the spacecraft Vostok 1. The U.S. became up with Project Mercury, in which NASA engineers designed a smaller, cone-shaped capsule that was lighter than Vostok. The engineers tested the craft with chimpanzees and held a final test flight in March 1961. Before the Soviets were able to pull ahead with Gagarin's launch. On May 5th, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space, which was a huge step forward for the U.S. After Shepard was sent into space in early May, President Kennedy made a bold statement later in the month that the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. In 1959, NASA picked the first group of astronauts. The 7 men would fly on the Mercury spacecraft. NASA called these men the Mercury 7. John Glenn was one of them. In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. He named his spacecraft Friendship 7. He made 3 orbits around Earth. He spent about 5 hours in space. His mission showed that the Mercury spacecraft worked in space. The mission also helped NASA learn more about being in space. After John Glenn left NASA, he became a U.S. Senator from the state of Ohio. He was a senator for 25 years. He now works with college students at Ohio State University in Columbus. In 1998, John Glenn got to fly to space again. He flew with 6 other astronauts on the space shuttle. It had been 36 years since the first space flight. Because NASA knew so much about Glenn, he was perfect for the job. He was 77 years old when he flew on the shuttle. He was the oldest person to fly in space. The America started the Apollo missions. However, Apollo suffered a setback in January 1967. 3 astronauts were killed after their spacecraft caught fire during a launch simulation, which you will see here. It was the first Apollo mission. The fire spread quickly in the oxygen-filled atmosphere of the capsule, killing the crew within seconds. The space crew, Flight Commander Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, were taking part in a test to run for the launch of the first Apollo mission. December 1968 then saw the launch of Apollo 8. This was the first manned space mission to actually orbit the moon. On July 16, 1969, U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on the Apollo 11 space mission with the goal of landing on the moon. These were the 3 men that died on Apollo 1. After landing successfully on July 20th, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon's surface, and as we all know, his famous words,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Oh, that looks beautiful from radio. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
Every precious minute of their 2.5 hours on the surface was programmed. Rock and soil samples were to be collected, photographs taken, experiments set up to catch unfiltered particles from the sun, to record moonquakes, to measure precisely by laser beam reflection the exact distance between moon and Earth.
Columbia, this is Houston, AOS, over. Houston, Columbia, Navigate, over. Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. They're setting up the flag now. I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
After Apollo 11 landed on the moon's surface in July 1969, 6 more Apollo missions followed by the end of 1972. Arguably the most famous was Apollo 13, whose crew managed to survive an explosion of the oxygen tank in their spacecraft service module on the way to the moon. There's a movie made about Apollo 13 starring Tom Hanks. By landing on the moon, the United States effectively won the space race that had begun with Sputnik's launch in 1957. Meanwhile, the Soviets made 4 failed attempts to launch a lunar landing craft between 1969 and 1972, including a spectacular launch pad explosion in July 1969. The various developments by the Soviet and U.S. space programs were heavily covered in the national media. Astronauts came to be seen as the ultimate American heroes, while the Soviets were pictured as the ultimate villains, with their efforts to surpass America and prove that their communist system was more powerful than the democratic Americans. Now we're just going to finish off this presentation by watching the Apollo 11 launch.